to say, this man has a scheduled wedding date. Can you please release him so that he can
release?
And the minister wrote back, says, no, we understand that, but he can get married in prison.
Oh.
But he will not be released.
Oh.
And we then decided to wait till I come out. When a year later, almost exactly a year later, we got married. But it was a very difficult one because I was a banned person. I couldn't move wherever I wanted. I had to be in the house at particular times. I couldn't be with more than 10 people. There could be no speeches in my presence. I couldn't move out of my...
Our guest today is Ibrahim Rasool. As in one of his interviews, the host decided to say His Excellency Ibrahim Rasool, a significant figure in the anti-apartheid South Africa's movement and post-apartheid political landscape, if that's the right term. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming to our show. We really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Aziz, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ambassador, as always, I would like to start with your upbringing, your family. We spoke before about your parents and your siblings. I would say you grew up in a medium to a large kind of family household. How was your relationship with your parents? Did it shape in any way your political career, your activism, especially when you got displaced, if that's the right term?
I think if I move very briefly from the broad family to the narrow family, I have a very interesting family heritage that set up a lot of the consciousness that I carry today. Mm. On my father's side, his father came with the father of Dalla Umar, our first Minister of Justice, from India, spent a few years in Mauritius and then moved to Cape Town and set up a fruit and vegetable business in Cape Town. My father married the Dutch daughter of the farmer that they bought their vegetables from. And, of course, Dalla Umar's father sent for a wife from India. But those were the only family we had. We grew up very closely together. And just imagine, when freedom comes, Dalla Umar becomes the Justice Minister under Nelson Mandela, and I become the Minister of Health and later the Premier of the Western Cape. So that's the kind of heritage on the one side. And I also grew up with the very painful thing that my grandmother, who could have been classified white, denounced the whiteness and adopted Islam as a religion and blackness as a culture. So that always was a very discordant thing in our heads. And on the other side, my family, my mother's side, my great-grandfather, Imam Ismail Slamang, was one of the founders of the Red Crescent Molu Jama. So we had a very kind of spiritual upbringing on that side.
What is the Red Crescent Molu Jama?
So the Red Crescent Molu Jama is a Jama that has been formed over 130 years ago in Cape Town. They were dedicated to the celebration of the birth of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So they were very active during the Maulud period, the birth period. They did the Ratibul Haddad and so forth, and very reminding of our roots in slavery and exile. And so we lived with that, not consciously, but that's the kind of family. And my father brought into the household. He was a very hardworking, austere, and very strict person. But he brought to the house a very rational Islam, always criticizing the ulama for being blind followers, always telling us never to do it. And he always brought books and 2 newspapers home every day, despite the fact that he left school before he could finish standard 6 or grade 8. My mother, and he sold fruit and vegetables, and later was just a salesman who had was self-taught. On the other hand, my mother worked in the clothing factories of Cape Town, and she brought that heritage of tradition into our house. So we grew up always with this combination of deep rationality about Islam and about life from my father, and deep spiritualism and traditionalism from my mother's side. The one was more Indian in culture, the other one was pure Malay in culture. So we had the best combination of foods that we could enjoy. But both my parents, despite never finishing high school, understood that the key to breaking poverty was education. They knew they were never going to leave us a great inheritance in money. But they said that they will break their backs working. And my mother almost literally broke hers in the factory. They will break their backs working to put us through high school and, if possible, university, so that we could be independent and earn better money than what they ever could in their life. And they were very proud people, particularly my father. He had a very anti-racial sense about him. He was always denied, despite being a fairly good rugby and cricket player. He knew he could go no further with his talent because of apartheid. We tasted the eviction from District 6 in 1972, and that formed another layer of political consciousness within us. And so a lot of that went into our household. And when I became political, they all became political. They were the first to join the UDF. My mother joined the United Women's Congress. My parents were members of the Detainees Parent Support Committee. They were the first to join the ANC when it was unbanned. And they supported me every step of the way, even though they faced many nights when the police and the army broke into our homes to come and detain me and to fetch me and to look for me. They were defiantly standing at that door while the police were doing their work. And so, alhamdulillah, I'm very grateful to my father's strictness and my mother's softness, because it created the balance in me. I'm very grateful for the rationality of my father and the spirituality of my mother, because that brought the balance in me. And I'm very, very grateful for my siblings who all threw themselves into the struggle in various degrees, and always never making me feel like an outlier or an outsider, but always that what I was doing was important.
Ambassador, I just want to go back a couple of steps. You mentioned the UDF. What is the UDF, and how did it come into surface in your life?
So the UDF is the United Democratic Front. It was formed in 1983, and I have served on its executive for much of its existence in the Western Cape, with a short stint on the national executive representing the Western Cape. I also was part of the formation of a Muslim political group called the Call of Islam. And that organization affiliated to the United Democratic Front. And so we were a full member of the UDF. And we were also a full member of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, which was called for by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and became the premier interfaith movement during the anti-apartheid struggle. And so that is really the kind of political history that we have been rooted in faith, but absolutely connected to everyone else, whether of other faiths or ideologies.
Was there any difference between the Call of Islam and the MYM, which you were part of, if not at some point the head of it, if I'm wrong?
I've never been the head of the MYM. I've served on the executive at UCT of the MSA. So I was part of the Islamic movement, enjoyed the Tarbiyah programs. But when the struggle broke, the MYM was caught in a bit of an inertia. Do we join or don't we join? It was a Hamlet moment for them, to be or not to be, to join or not to join, to act or not to act. And for some of us in the Islamic movement, we found that we were going to really do harm to Islam if we stayed outside of the main theater of political struggle. And that's when we formed the Call of Islam. And we threw ourselves into that main theater of the interfaith world, of the political world, of the inter-ideological world. And alhamdulillah, I think that together with individual heroism by Muslims like Ahmad Katrada, Dr. Saluji, Dr. Kachalia, Fatima and Ismail Mir, etc., Dr. Dadu, Amina Kachalia, the names just reverberate in my head. But that, I think, has meant that the respect and love for Islam and Muslims in this country has always been great.
I wanna mention something, and I would love to know more about it. Your love story, how you got married, how did you meet your wife? Was it during the struggle, and did it have any effect?
So, I was a teacher in 1985. I had been part of the school boycotts of the 1980s. Then I went to university. Then I started teaching in Spine Road in Mitchells Plain, Cape Town. And then by October, the state of emergency was declared in Cape Town. And when that state of emergency was declared, a whole lot of us who were activists were arrested by the police, and I was taken to Victor Verster prison. In prison, I found that there were quite a few students and teachers from the schools in the northern suburbs like Belhar. Next to me, next to my cell, was someone called Edgar Pieterse. Today is Professor Edgar Pieterse at UCT, and he was on the SRC with a woman called Rashida Shahabuddin, who was the secretary of the SRC, but she had evaded arrest that year. And he basically spoke to me that she's a very conscious Muslim, but that she would really benefit if she joined the Call of Islam.
At that time, it was just joining Call of Islam.
It was all about joining the Call of Islam. And 6 months after our release, he called and he said, "Have you not recruited Rashida yet?" So 2 of us went on a mission to establish a khalqa, a cell in Belhar, and the contact person would be Rashida Shahabuddin. And out of that, we got a group of people together who formed a very strong foundation for the Call of Islam and later for the UDF in the Belhar area. And that's how I met Rashida Shahabuddin through Edgar. And we were just getting engaged when I was arrested for my second stint in detention. And I stayed in prison this time for more than a year. And in that time, Rashida took over the amirship of the Call of Islam, which is completely radical. Because which other movement, let alone a political Muslim movement, has a woman as its amir? Not amira.
Yes, as amir.
But as the amir. And so that is how Rashida had then developed in the Call of Islam. She became a great member of the Women's Liberation Movement, later Gender Commissioner. But when I came out of prison in 1988, we had missed our wedding. We had a wedding scheduled for December 1987. And effectively, my lawyers, Issa Musa, Al-Marhoom, he wrote to Adrian Vlok, the Minister of Police, to say, "This man has a scheduled wedding date. Can you please release him so that he can..."
Release,
and the Minister wrote back, says, "No, we understand that, but he can get married in prison. But he will not be released." And we then decided to wait till I come out. When a year later, almost exactly a year later, we got married. But it was a very difficult one because I was a banned person. I couldn't move wherever I wanted. I had to be in the house at particular times. I couldn't be with more than 10 people. There could be no speeches in my presence. I couldn't move out of my
So it was
majesty.
like a small kind of ceremony, would you say? The wedding, because of all of this.
My brother. We then had to seek about 7 different permissions. One, to get married. We hired, or we were donated, the UWC Student Center. There were 1,000 people who were coming to the wedding, including people like Trevor Manuel and Cheryl Carolus wearing hijab and all of those kind of things. Tala Umar was the only person, leader of the UDF, that was not banned, and he was a family person given the history.
Yes.
And so he did the speech there. Rashida insisted that she wanted to be present at her own wedding, and men and women would be in the same hall. That's why we did the nikah in the hall and the reception. We had to be outside after 6 o'clock. So on the way home, taking the bride home, I had to stop at the Athlone police station to go and sign the book there. And all of those kind of things. So basically, it was a very special wedding under all of those repressive conditions. But alhamdulillah, Rashida did not once flinch because she was an activist in her own right. And we went on honeymoon to the South Cape, and every morning at 6 o'clock, I had to get up to go and sign at the police station. So that was the condition under which we have been married. We are now married for 36 years, alhamdulillah. We have 2 wonderful children, and we remain committed both to ourselves and to the struggle.
From the ambassador, we spoke previously about your interesting relationship with Madiba. How did it form? And you guys went to, there was like an interesting trip to the US, and you shared his trip to in the African continent. Can you share some stories? How was the relationship?
So, like all activists' relationship with Madiba, it starts with a mythology. You know the legend of the man. You sing songs for his liberation. You pledge commitment to be a soldier of Nelson Mandela. And then suddenly you find yourself in the same prison as what he is in 1987, Pollsmoor prison. And then one day the warden comes and he says, Rasool, get dressed. You're going to the hospital. And I say to him, no, but I'm okay. He says, no, just do what I'm telling you. And as we walk, he says, don't make a noise. And I follow him, and we come to the door of the hospital. He says, go in there. And if anyone speaks to you, you don't speak loudly. And in I go, and then a minute or two later, a tall, grey-headed man comes walking out. He didn't look like the photos I had seen with a round face and the middle path. But I knew it was Nelson Mandela.
At that time, you didn't meet him. You haven't met him before. You only saw the pictures.
I just saw the pictures. And here was this man coming in. And he says, Ibrahim. I said, Madiba. He says, yes. I said, you wanted to see me? He says, yeah, I know. You are doing very interesting things in this Muslim community. You know, sometimes this community of yours can be very alone. They stand one side, but you have brought them to struggle with black people. You know how proud we are that you are with us. No longer just as individuals, because Kathy is always, Ahmed Katrana has always been with us, but now you've brought masses of Muslims into the struggle, marching with us. I said, yeah, but that we stand for justice. And it's justice for everybody. He says, yeah, that's what you're doing different. And we really appreciate it. And so we discussed, he wanted to know about the other political detainees with me, how we're coping. I said, look, we have 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds with us and so forth, and they cry themselves to sleep at night and so forth. So he says, you know, I'm now for 22 years or so in prison, so I have some privileges. Every Friday night I get a projector and I watch films. I will make sure that the warden brings the projector to your cells on a Saturday night, and you can also watch the films. And so we started watching the films that Madiba was watching. And it was not, we thought we were going to get Police Academy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But we were learning now about how Madiba was actually preparing himself. So here was a man sentenced to life, but he was preparing himself to become a leader in a free South Africa. So who am I to cry? Because I've now spent a year in prison. When this man is 20 odd years in prison and is still focused on coming out and being part of a new society. And so that was it. And then, of course, when he came out eventually, he asked me to accompany him to the Awal Masjid that he wanted to watch. We then went with him to the qabr of Tuan Guru Qadi Abdul Salam because he wanted to pay tribute, because he then said, I thought I was the first political prisoner. And then I saw the grave of Sheikh Matura, and I knew that your people were struggling for freedom long before us. You were on Robben Island. So it's just that deep sense of respect for Islam and Muslims that he had. And then, of course, a few months after his release, he asked me to go with him on this African trip. I mean, it's probably about 3 weeks or so, 14 countries, meeting the names you've only read about in the world: Gaddafi, Mubarak, the FLN in Algeria, Obasanjo in Nigeria. I met some of the ANC leadership in Lusaka, like Thabo Mbeki, Dos Santos, and visited the ANC guerrilla camp in Angola at Vianney, etc. I mean, it was of the most fascinating periods that I shared with Nelson Mandela. And then just finally, I think that that when I was the Minister of Health and later the Premier in the Western Cape, every year in December, Nelson Mandela would ask me to accompany him for 3 days, and we take him to children's hospitals, creches, orphanages, wherever children were in trouble, and we drive together to all of those, to about over 3 days, about 10 different places, and we'd be followed by the sweets trucks, the cool drink trucks, the chops trucks, the entertainers, etc., etc. And he would have Christmas parties with all of those children, and I was just absolutely honored to be able to do those kind of things with a Nelson Mandela.
But before I go to the US, there was like a beautiful, funny story in Libya that happened with you and Madiba. If you can tell us about that.
So when we came to Libya, of course, the brother leader, Muammar al-Gaddafi, had made sure that we drive from Tripoli right through into the desert, where he was in his palace that had been bombed by the Americans. And we sat in the ruins of that with the brother leader and exchanging thoughts and so forth. And then when we went back to our hotel, I remember it was on the, we call it the promenade. I think they call it the Corniche in Tripoli. And that was our hotel. And we were going to leave now for the airport because we had our next appointment was Cairo in Egypt with Mubarak. And suddenly the Libyan drivers with me in the car.
You were a different car than Madiba.
Yeah, no. We all had our own car with our own luggage and everything like that. they got lost in a traffic jam. And for some reason or other, they made me miss my plane. So they took me to within Tripoli, not back to my hotel, but to this kind of fortress, which I think also contained the headquarters of the Mukhabarat. And in this place that they said, oh, you'll stay here until we can get you to join Madiba again. I met freedom fighters from different parts of the world, from Malta, from Argentina. Were all staying in this kind of camp and so forth. And then some of these people then came to me and said, listen, man, you're a Muslim. Your loyalty is to Islam first. I said, obviously. They said, so you should also then be quite loyal to the brother leader. I said, oh, we all love the brother leader in South Africa. He says, no, but you see, the brother leader needs to know everything that Nelson Mandela is thinking and doing and where he's going and what he's saying, etc. I said, oh, no, what's the... He says, no, because that's the very important intelligence that we require and we need you to be. I said, so you're asking me to spy on Nelson Mandela? He said, no, don't call it spying, just the brother leader needs information. I said, at that point, someone comes in and then the session comes to an end, and then they tell me that you'll be on the first flight out tomorrow morning. And it was basically, when I came to Cairo, Madiba said when they came there, they realized that I wasn't there. And he phoned Gaddafi. And he said to Gaddafi, if I'm not there on the first flight, he's coming back to fetch me. And so that ended that. It was a typical Gaddafi story. I'm just amazed that I could be on the other side of such an engagement.
Ambassador, I want to go to the US. Your first deployment day during President Obama's time. What do you think Ambassador Rasool achieved during that time?
Look, I think that diplomacy has 3 tracks. There's the political one, which includes the geopolitical, the bilateral political relationship between the country you represent and the country in which you are. But then you also explain your own country's geopolitical stance on quite a few things. There's the second track, which is public diplomacy, the diplomacy of reaching out to the American citizenry. And we had deep roots in America because of the anti-apartheid struggle, resonance with the African American community, and the potential growth, because I was Muslim, in our relationship with the Muslim communities of the United States. And then the third track is economic diplomacy. And the major challenge for economic diplomacy is how to get more investment into South Africa. And secondly, how to make sure that South Africa remains part of the African Growth and Opportunities Act, because that was coming up for review in 2015. And so basically, if you look at achievements on all 3 tracks like that, I think I was able because the Obama administration, him himself being black, there was a warmth in our relationship, even if we disagreed on some of his geopolitical stances. But there was a warmth. When the Arab Springs happened, we could explain it to them, and we were able to put South Africa's position regarding the Arab Spring and to remind them, why do you fear democracy and human rights and freedom in the Middle East when you love it for yourself? And that's when I invented the idea that America loves to give the Muslim world a triple bypass of freedom, human rights, and democracy, because it has a bifocal lens called oil and Israel. And that was the terms in which we engaged the Obama administration. On the public diplomacy, we really moved the USA because there was a warmth at the way in which South Africa had hosted the 2010 World Cup. There was the centenary celebrations of the African National Congress that everyone knew who were part of the anti-apartheid struggle. And there was the frailty of Nelson Mandela, because when people saw him come to close the 2010 World Cup, they saw a man who no longer walked. He was sitting on a golf cart, very frail and weak. And when he passed away in 2013, we had 31 memorial services across the USA, including in the Washington National Cathedral, with Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Kerry, half the Congress, everyone present. So that was a very, very successful track. But on the economic diplomacy, I mean, every month we had a dinner at our house with key investors. It was always filled with 20 investors coming to make the case for South Africa and Africa. And we were able to really get real good investment, so much so that we were able to restore the investment levels to its pre-economic meltdown phase. And we restored the trade under AGOA and won the renewal of AGOA for South Africa. So I think that those are some of the very critical gains out of that first stint in the United States.
But Ambassador, don't you think it's unusual for someone to be appointed as an ambassador to a country for again for the second time? What do you think the president's motivation to send you back there to DC?
It is fairly unprecedented. Just imagine the irony. December 2014, I finished off as South Africa's ambassador. December 2024, I returned as South Africa's ambassador, exactly 10 years later. So that's a delicious irony. The key point is that I think the president needs us to consolidate the relationship with the USA, needs us to repair, iron out misunderstandings, and needs someone who could be an explainer-in-chief on the first track of the politics and the geopolitical positions that South Africa has taken. Secondly, reach out to the US public, its think tanks and communities. And thirdly, make sure that we don't lose AGOA and that we don't lose trade, because there are 211 US Congress people who are pushing for South Africa to be evicted from those trade agreements. But in the normal course of things, an ambassador would land in Washington and can wait for up to 3 months before they are credentialed, before they can work. I don't think we have that time. Secondly, once the ambassador is credentialed, the ambassador has to find his or her feet, understanding the terrain, knowing how Congress works, etc., and making contacts. And I don't think that we have that time. So I think that one of the things that Minister Ronald Lamola has said, that we want an ambassador who can hit the ground running, who knows the situation, who can work both sides of the aisle, Democratic and Republican, and who can look after South Africa's interests. So I think that's my mandate, and that's the reason that I go back to Washington.
Ambassador, in a lot of your interviews recently, you spoke about AGOA and $51 billion, $20 billion. Briefly, for an ordinary person, what is AGOA? How important it is to South Africa and to the US?
So President Bill Clinton introduced, as a gesture of goodwill to Africa and for Africa's development, he introduced the African Growth and Opportunities Act, which allows Africa to send just around 4,000 products to the United States, which will be exempt from taxes and tariffs. And African states have used this. Some send 20 products, some send 100, South Africa sends over 2,000 products. Most send raw materials. 70% of what South Africa exports to the United States are manufactured. It's rich with jobs and employment possibilities. And its value every year is in excess of 20 billion US dollars. It includes sophisticated stuff like BMW 3 Series cars. It includes medical stuff like medical nuclear isotopes that's used in the fight for cancer. It includes oranges that come from the Western Cape and that go to America in their off-season, and 2,000 such products, ice creams, everything that you can imagine. And so when I say that we've got to fight for it, because I say it because just imagine, we already have a 31% unemployment rate. Just imagine we can't sell those oranges to the United States. What happens to 20,000 farm workers? Just imagine we are isolated from the United States, and Ford, who manufactures cars here for the African market, Ford no longer wants to have its plant here. It wants to move its plant to Kenya. What happens to the thousands of jobs and people that depend on that? So the economic diplomacy is the foundation of our interests. So what it basically means is that we've got to go and fight for those interests, because the interests go into pharmaceutical products, the interests go into mining, the interests go into agriculture, into automotive, into foams, all of those kind of things. And we need to be able to make sure that we keep it.
How difficult would your job be in the Trump presidency as opposed to Obama's one?
It's a completely different party. It's a completely different personality. It's a completely different world. And one can deal with a personality, but you're dealing with a post-truth world, a world of populism, a world of hyper-emotionalism, a world of otherization. When you don't know someone, you don't understand someone, you make them the other, the enemy. And it's not a world that necessarily has a tolerance for long explanations, because its attention span is very short. And so, if ever there was a moment in which we needed to speak with simplicity, with a clarity, with a sense of purpose into that world, this is what it's going to be. It's going to be very, very difficult. But I think we've got to try it. And this is where you draw on your upbringing in Islam. When in Surah Rahman, Allah says, we have given people the capacity for intelligent speech. When Musa alayhi salam says to his brother Harun, can you go with me and speak for me because my tongue is tied? When Allah says in Surah Al-A'raf that to every people I send someone who can speak their language. So I ask myself, and I'm not at all comparing myself to a prophet, but if I must follow the prophetic example, what language do I speak to the Donald Trump administration? They speak English. But that's not the language. I need to enter their language of transactionalism, of deal making. With Obama, I spoke the language of solidarity, their affinity to Africa and South Africa. Now I must speak where there is suspicion, but I must transform suspicion into transaction. I want to say, I can't say to President Trump, listen, President Trump, we are poor in Africa, can you help us? He doesn't respect that. That's weakness for him. I must say to him, President Trump, what we have in South Africa are critical minerals. Why don't you send investors to turn those minerals into the usable parts of the e-revolution that is happening with electric cars, with cell phone technology, with computers and so forth?
I believe you called it a moral superpower.
I'm saying that South Africa, in its politics and geopolitics, is a moral superpower. And when we speak to American public in our public diplomacy, we speak as a moral superpower, even one who lost its way with corruption and is recovering, even one where the ANC lost its majority but formed the government of national unity rather than a coup d'etat. So we are, in that sense, and with that authority, we've got to go and make a deal now. And so that is where we now have to go, because Donald Trump, he's the author of a book called The Art of the Deal. So we've got to change our language to the incumbents in Washington, but not change our values.
Ambassador, I wanna end up with the important topic of the time now, Palestine. Where did Palestine fit in? When did Palestine fit in Ambassador's life? I believe because you grew up in the struggle, Palestine was always there. But when was the first time? And I want to end up with Palestine now in Ambassador's life in Washington with the new administration.
You know, Aziz, even before I was a fly on the wall when Nelson Mandela reunited with Yasser Arafat in Cairo on that fateful trip. I arrived in time for that meeting after being detained by the Libyans.
Yes.
I arrived in time for that meeting and saw this great warmth. Even before, that was just an affirmation of what we already believed. It was not the start of solidarity with the Palestinians. The exchange about how our fighters trained together in Algeria and so forth was absolutely fundamental. But it was a confirmation of what I already felt and my spirit soared when I was there. Early already in 1985, the Call of Islam had written Palestine into its policy as a critical twin struggle that we are busy with. By 1986, Rashida was already arrested for protesting outside the Israeli embassy because those were the dangerous times. The only people who came to that protest outside were 12 Call of Islam volunteers who came. You see, the hadith, the saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is so specific. The greatest jihad is to speak the truth in the face of a tyrant. It's easy to speak the truth when the tyrant has retired, when the tyrant has been defeated. Now you get 100,000 people marching. 1986 in the state of emergency, when Rashida and other Call of Islam people were arrested, the tyrant was alive and well. He was there with Caspers. He shot and he arrested. So that's how deep our relationships are. It's part of our formative history in the Call of Islam and will never be erased from us. It's part of the ANC's DNA because we trained together in the camps with the PLO. And so this is not new. This is old and long-standing. And so it's when I now go to Washington, part of the threat against South Africa to remove us from AGOA, to remove us from investment, to withdraw US companies from South Africa, it is not so much Russia, Ukraine. That's debatable.
Palestine.
It's Palestine. Because what the US does not appreciate isn't only that we went to the International Court of Justice and charged Palestine with Israel with genocide against the Palestinians. It is that we awakened the new generation of Americans to the injustice. Up till that moment, everyone grew up with a mantra that Israel is always right. Israel is the victim of history. Anyone who's against Israel is anti-Semitic. South Africa changed the narrative. And that's what they can't forgive us for, because they will never regain the traction amongst young Americans to say that Israel is right, when everyone can see on television and social media that Israel is wrong. And that's why some of them want to punish us. So it's very instructive that just before Minister Lamola announced that the president had appointed me to Washington, his statements just before that was that we have this week handed in our memorials to the International Criminal Court of Justice. We have placed on record all the evidences we have of genocide. So what that means for my diplomacy is that I don't have to go and use the megaphone. I'm not the chief activist for Palestine, but I am part of the custodianship of our legal case. I must be the explainer in chief of our legal case, because we now leave it in the hands of the judges of the ICJ. The government needed to compensate for Muslim and Arab silence in the world by picking up the megaphone and pronouncing the genocide. Our government had to do that. Now the world knows it. Let us now drive the legal case against Israel, and let civil society pick up the megaphones. Let's hope other Muslim communities pick up the megaphones, the other leaders. But South Africa must also now defend its interests, because there are other values attached to 31% of our people being unemployed. There are values attached to the loss of jobs of 20,000 orange farm workers in South Africa if we get kicked out of AGOA. So a government does not trade off values. It holds all the values up, and it keeps a balance amongst all of those values. And we have done more than could be expected of a poor, fragile nation on the southern tip of Africa. We have punched above our weight. We have done what we can do, but we have pushed it to the brink of our potential extermination as a viable economic country looking after its people. And I say this, our people, even Muslims, will punish an ANC government for 4 hours of load shedding, for potholes in the road. Imagine we push our point so far that the lights totally go off and the economy collapses and we can't maintain any roads, let alone build roads. The same people who pushed you to push to the edge will be the first ones to turn against you.
Ambassador, finally, a message you would send to the young generation, how would they expect, or what would they expect from Ambassador Rasool in the US now when it comes to South Africa and when it comes to the international kind of crisis like Palestine and Sudan and others?
I would want to say to young people that I have young children. I want them to love South Africa and be proud of living in South Africa. I don't want my son to have come out of the university and say, I'm looking for a job overseas. I want them to find that South Africa's industrial revolution is moving on. South Africa's fourth industrial revolution, the technological revolution, is moving on. I want them to find engineering opportunities, medical opportunities. I want them to find infrastructure opportunities, technology opportunities in South Africa and serve this continent. We cannot be a backwater. And the investments I look for are the investments that will say to our young generation, please stay because the opportunities are here. And we say to Americans, come to Africa and come to South Africa because there's money to be made and there's a skilled workforce. But I will also say to Americans, with enough confidence, inshallah, I will say to them, you will find the most talented young people in South Africa, but don't think that they are values neutral. Don't think that they are just automatons without ideology and without politics. Know that they are as good as what they are because their values tell them that there's something wrong in Palestine. There's something unbalanced in the Russia-Ukraine war, that there is something unjust about authoritarianism in the Muslim world. There's something wrong in the imbalances in the gender relations in the world. There's something unlawful about the Islamophobia and the racism and the misogyny that exists in the world. They are not values free, but their values make them even more talented. And you must learn to live with that, to cope with that, and to ride with that, because it will make you the ethical companies that you need to be.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your lovely time. We wish you all the best in your journey in the next 4 years.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. And until next episode, goodbye.